There is a seeming paradox in our time when you think about the situation in Gaza, the war between Israel and the Hamas. The Jewish people, as you know, for hundreds of years have been persecuted in Europe because of anti-Semitism. And they thought of themselves as the victims of all this persecution and oppression. But nowadays, they have been accused of committing not only apartheid against the Palestinians, but also committing genocide right now in Gaza. But why? Isn't that paradoxical? So it seems. Here is a people who have been persecuted for such a long time. They should know better about oppression, about persecution, about victimhood, and yet they are now accused with evidences that they are committing genocide against the Palestinians. Why? How can we understand this? What is the future of humanity on the basis of this question? How does this affect the future of Israel and Palestine? Hello, my name is Dr. Peter Baofu, and I'm going to answer this question in this presentation today. The beginning of my analysis has to do with the understanding of power. In other words, we have to understand why Israel has been able to accumulate all this power to commit genocide and apartheid against others, in this case the Palestinians, with the support of Western world, especially the unconditional support of the US. You may ask the rhetorical question, how come the Palestinians have not received the unconditional support of the US or Western powers, while Israel has been able to receive the unconditional support, not Palestinians? Well, there are many factors, but I would like to summarize and focus on three of them. The first factor has to do with Zionism. In a recent article that I just published, and the title of the article is Israel, Genocide, and the Curse of Unchecked Power, I have already answered the question. But let me summarize them for your convenience. First factor has to do with Zionism, the Zionist project. It was a nationalistic movement for the formation of a new Jewish homeland for the Jews. There are several reasons why, at the time, some Christians in Europe supported the Jews for the Zionist project. The first reason was because it was a win-win situation for both the Christians and the Jews. As you may remember, at that time, and even before that, there was the Jewish question in Europe to be resolved because of anti-Semitism. What is the solution? Many Christians at that time did not like the Jews, and the Jews did not get along with them in many parts of Europe. So one solution, as proposed by Theodor Herzl, the founding father of Zionism is to say that the Zionist project for the formation of Israel in Palestine can be a solution for the Jewish question because it allowed the Jews to emigrate from Europe to Palestine, and therefore the Europeans did not need to cope with the problem of the Jews or the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. And for the Jews, it was also beneficial because now they have a new homeland. So it was a win-win situation for the two sides. But there was also another reason. And the second reason was that the Christians in Europe for centuries had some problem with Muslims because of the holy wars earlier. Because of this kind of historical legacy, the Zionists also argued that the formation of Israel could be useful for the West because it can be used as a colonial outpost to protect Europe from Orientalism. In other words, Israel can be used as a buffer zone against the encroachment of Orientalism into Europe. That means Israel was to stand for Occidentalism against Orientalism. At that time, there was the narrative that the Western world was more civilized, superior than the Oriental world of the Arabs in the Middle East. The latter was considered as primitive, uncivilized, and therefore Occidentalism is not to be mixed with Orientalism. And the Zionists skillfully argued that Israel stood for Occidentalism and not with Orientalism. And that's why, for these two reasons, at the beginning, at that time, many of the Zionists were not Jewish. They were Christians. Why did they bother to support the Jewish movement? Because of these two reasons. And besides, there's also something else too. At that time, there was a very wealthy, powerful Jewish family in Europe, and they were located in the UK. And they are known as the Rothschild family. And they supported the Zionist project. The Rothschild family was important over here for the support of the Zionist project in two different ways. The first way is that the Rothschild family helped financing the Jewish settlement in Palestine. The second way is that the Rothschild family helped financing the British government war efforts over the years. For these two reasons, for example, and others, in 1917, the British government made the Balfour Declaration for the support of the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And the second factor has to do with the Cold War, the legacy of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US were competing for influence in the Middle East. For example, during the wars between Israel and its neighbors, the US supported Israel and the Soviet Union supported the enemies of or the rivals of Israel. And during the Nixon administration, for example, there was also the grand strategy following into the footsteps of George Kennan's policy of containment. To unite NATO countries, for example, in Western Europe, Israel and some of the allies of the US in the Middle East, Pakistan and some of the US allies in South Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines in Southeast Asia, Japan and Korea in Northeast Asia, together in an encirclement in the Eurasian continent against the communist bloc. In fact, in 1973, the Nixon administration went one step further and tried to lure the People's Republic of China away from the communist bloc against the Soviet Union. Now, the third factor for the understanding of the unconditional support of Israel by the US and Western powers. A good example is the Jewish lobby. Everyone knows that there is the Jewish lobby in the US. The Jewish lobby has been quite influential in shaping the public opinions in the US concerning Israel especially. There are three ways for them to do that. The first way is to control mass media, the ownership of mass media, like the New York Times, which has published a lot of articles often very favorable to Israel, but quite critical to the Palestinians and others in the Middle East. The second way is for them to influence think tanks and universities. For example, last year in 2023, as some of you may remember, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, her name is Liz McGill, appeared at a congressional hearing, but she was hesitating to answer the question whether calling for the genocide of Jews is a violation of the code of conduct or should be regarded as part of free speech. Immediately, the governor of Pennsylvania, his name is Josh Shapiro, himself a Jewish Democrat, pressure McGill to resign. And then the Jewish university donor, his name is Rose Stevens, threatened to withdraw $100 million donation from the university unless McGill resigned. A few days later, McGill resigned. And the third way for them to influence public opinion is in politics, when they carried a lot of weight in campaign donations. If any politician who say anything which is critical to Israel and sympathetic to the Palestinians, they could be attacked immediately. And they will not be supported from many donors. On the contrary, if any of them, like the past presidential election, including Trump and Harris, all of them have been very favorable to Israel, and they received a lot of support from the groups. In these three ways, the Jewish lobby is a major factor behind the unconditional support of Israel by the US, especially in this context. So these three factors together allow the narrative that Israel is part of the West, and nowadays in America and also in Western Europe too, you hear the narrative of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is to portray Israel as part of the West. Now, there's some truth to that because the Christian religion is based on not just on the New Testament, but also a derivation from the Old Testament, which consists of Jewish scriptures. But the narrative of the Judeo-Christian tradition is a reinterpretation of history because in many cases it was a narrative. Is not necessarily true. Let me give you two examples. There are two fundamental differences between the Christians and the Jews. The first one has to do with anti-Semitism, and the second one has to do with anti-Judaism. The first one has to do with anti-Semitism for two different reasons, among others. The first reason was because at that time, the Christians were discouraged from money lending, namely usury, because it was considered as sinful. The Jews, on the other hand, were not Christians, and therefore they were allowed to engage in money lending in banking. Over time, the Jews monopolized banking, in this case, money lending. And over time, they tended to charge high interest rates because of the monopoly. The Christians, of course, did not like this. And they often considered the Jews in this sense as loan sharks. The second reason was because the Jews discouraged Jewish men from marrying non-Jewish women because they were afraid to lose Judaism over time. And the second disagreement had to do with anti-Judaism. As you may remember, it was the Roman Judea who sought the execution of Jesus Christ. For the Christians, therefore, they considered the Jews as God killers. And therefore, they considered themselves as superseding the Jews as the chosen ones, not the Jews. For these two reasons, to lump together the Christians and the Jews in this sense is to obscure these two fundamental historical differences. For these two reasons, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, there are some fundamental disagreement between the two groups, and to group them together into the Judeo-Christian tradition is a contemporary interpretation of the history of Israel and the West, in this case, as part of the legacy of this formation of Israel to portray it as part of the West. So no matter what it is, these are the three major factors that I just mentioned, which have allowed Israel to receive supportive enthusiasm from not only the Western powers, but especially the US. Now, when they have all this accumulation of power, what they have been doing. Now, let's go to the second part of my analysis. The second part of my analysis has to do with this unconditional support of Israel by the United States and other Western powers. I want to focus on how this unconditional support has emboldened Israel and has tempted Israel to commit brutality and atrocity against others. And this brutality and atrocity can be classified into three kinds of crimes, both in wartime and in peacetime. The first one has to do with genocide. As many of you know, in 2024, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, had officially requested an arrest warrant against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense chief over the genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. 2 months later, also in 2024, the Amnesty International had also issued a fresh warning to the US over complexity with Israel to transfer weapons to Israel to commit genocide against the Palestinians. The second category has to do with crimes against humanity. Unlike genocide, crimes against humanity can be committed in peace times. Especially over here, a good example is apartheid. In 2022, the Amnesty International had investigated this issue and written a report entitled Israel's Apartheid Against the Palestinians. And then in 2006, Jimmy Carter, the former US president, had written a book entitled Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And these two cases is to show that the crimes against humanity, in this case, apartheid, have been committed by Israel against Palestinians as the open prison in the world. And the last category has to do with war crimes. Unlike genocide and crimes against humanity, war crimes can be committed by individual soldiers. For example, intentionally killing women and children, intentionally killing prisoners of war, unnecessarily killing civilians, unnecessarily destroying civilian property, and many others. In 2024, a researcher working for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Law Services, Cliff Baldwin, had written a report. And in this report, he identified 5 war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza. I had already written about this in a previous article of mine published in 2023 about these 5 war crimes against Palestinians. The title of my article is Why Israel's brutality to Palestinians endangers itself and Jews worldwide. These three different categories of crimes are a summary of the brutality, which is the consequence of the unconditional support of the US and other powers for Israel. Now, the next question is, what are the consequences of this atrocity and brutality in relation to the national interest of the US and Israel? Now we go to part 3 of the analysis. The third part of my analysis has to do with the consequences of this atrocity and brutality committed by Israel against the Palestinians in the Middle East as a result of the unconditional support of Israel by the US and other Western powers. There are three major consequences that I want to focus on over here, which can damage the national security and national interests of both Israel and the US. And therefore, this unconditional support is self-defeating and self-destructive. The first consequence had to do with the increase of anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism around the world. A good example of this is that earlier this year, in September of 2024, a large numbers of diplomats in the United Nations walked out in protest against the speech given by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the United Nations General Assembly. And earlier this year, Time magazine have done a report. And in this report, Time magazine have shown that more than 42 out of 43 countries surveyed in the report shown an increase of anti-Semitism around the world. And in 42 out of 43 countries, Israel had been viewed unfavorably. And these two examples are very telling about the decrease of soft power as a consequence of this unconditional support. The second consequence has to do with the increased burden of the US to get stuck in the Middle East, to continue supporting Israel in its offensive against multiple adversaries in the Middle East. For example, against the Hamas in Gaza, against the Hezbollah in Lebanon, against the Houthis in Yemen, against the Shiites in Iran. And this increase of burden has a tremendous trade-off. The more time, energy, and resources that the US spend in the Middle East, the less time, energy, and resources that the US had to confront China as a rising superpower. I have already spoken about this in my previous publication. In my book, published in 1999, more than 25 years ago, I had already predicted the rise of China as the dominant superpower on Earth. in 2006, I wrote another book titled Beyond the World of Titans and the Remaking of World Order, in which I predicted both China and India could emerge as the dominant superpower that the US and the EU have to cope with. And later on in 2020, I wrote another article in which I predicted the coming of the Second Cold War between the US and China. And the title of the article is Why Coronavirus Pandemic is Accelerating the Remaking of World Order in the Second Cold War. And then in 2023, I wrote another article to further analyze specific features of the Second Cold War. And the article is entitled The Globalization and the Dollarization in the Second Cold War. Now, the third consequence. The third consequence has to do with the increased perception of the US in the global south that the US is not a neutral, is not an effective peace broker in the Middle East, because the US has continued to unconditionally favor Israel against others in the Middle East. The US time again and again and again has vetoed all the resolutions which try to criticize Israel, apartheid and genocide, let's say, against the Palestinians. And this is important because it opened up an opportunity for China to come in to play the alternative peace brokers. Two good examples exactly happened this year. Earlier this year, for the first time, China was able to mediate different factions of the Palestinians, the Fatah and the Hamas, to come together to bridge the gap of the differences so that they can work together for the future of Palestine. And the second example is that China was able to bridge the gap between Iran and Saudi Arabia to open up the normalization of diplomatic relations between the two so as to increase peace in the Middle East. All these two have been possible because the US have been ineffective in bringing peace in the Middle East, because the US has continued to give unconditional support to Israel no matter what. And these are the three consequences which are damaging to the national interests of the US and Israel. Now, what is the conclusion of my talk? Part 4 of my analysis is about the conclusion of this presentation. In summary, part 1 of my analysis is about the three factors which have contributed to the unconditional support of Israel by the US and other Western powers. Part 2 of my analysis is about the three kinds of violation of international and humanitarian law due to the unconditional support of Israel by the US and other Western powers. Part 3 of my analysis is about the 3 consequences to the national security and interests of Israel and the U.S. due to the violation of international and humanitarian law as a result of the unconditional support of Israel by the U.S. and other Western powers. So now, what is the conclusion? What can we learn from this analysis? I propose 3 lessons that we can learn from my analysis. The first lesson has to do with what I call the curse of unchecked power. As you may remember, at the beginning of my presentation, I said that I had written an article as the basis of this presentation. The title of this article is Israel, Genocide, and the Curse of Unchecked Power. It was published a few weeks ago. As long as power is unchecked, because it receives unconditional support by other major powers, over time it becomes corrupt. And it will tempt those who have this power to commit genocide, apartheid, and war crimes. And the lesson to learn over here is that this kind of power is cursed in the sense that those who commit atrocity and brutality like this can feel good in the short term, but they will pay for it in the long term. It's not sustainable. I just show you the 3 consequences which damage the national security and interests of Israel and the U.S. a while ago. The second lesson has to do with the 3 factors which have contributed to this unconditional support for unchecked power. These 3 factors are not sustainable. Namely, the first has to do with the Zionist mindset to exclude Orientalism and to favor Occidentalism. That is not sustainable. Number 2, the second one is the Cold War mindset to polarize the world into 2 opposing camps. That is also not sustainable. And the third mindset is the Jewish lobby bias to favor Israel and the Jews at the expense of the Palestinians and others in the Middle East. That is also not sustainable. And the 3 consequences that I just mentioned is to show you that this kind of mindsets are self-destructive. Finally, the third, though not the least, lesson that we can learn from this analysis is the right to exist and the right to self-defend. Israel, of course, has the right to exist. In fact, Israel has already existed since 1948, for many decades now. But Western mass media do not like to talk about the right of the Palestinians to create a nation state. The Palestinians also have the right to exist as a nation state, as long as they are denied to have such a nation state and live under apartheid, genocide, and war crimes. There will be no peace in the Middle East. And also, the right to self-defend. Israel, of course, has the right to defend itself, but Israel has already defended itself successfully times and again because of the unconditional support of the U.S. and other Western powers. The Western mass media do not like to talk about the right of the Palestinians to defend themselves against genocide, apartheid, and war crimes. As long as the Palestinians are denying to have this kind of right to defend themselves in Western mass media, there will be no peace in the Middle East. Fortunately, all is not lost in humanity. There is some hope. A good example is the rise of an alternative power center nowadays, as the global power structure has shifted from the West to the East in the 18th century, which I have already predicted in my previous publication that I told you. The two good examples that I just mentioned are the one between the Hamas and the Fatah as brokered by China. And the second example is about the normalization of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia as brokered by China. As the alternative power center in the world have shifted, there will be more and more efforts to work on a solution in the Middle East which can be more impartial, more neutral, more effective. But as long as Israel receives the unconditional support of the US and other Western powers, as long as they play the dominant role in that region because of the use of force, there cannot be peace in the Middle East. But there's hope. The hope is that things are changing now. I therefore send my best wishes to the Middle East, and I wish all of you a good day.